Arecebo Observatory's massive radio dish was many things to many people: pulsar finder, broadcaster to aliens, asteroid mapper, Bond villain's hidden satellite dish, Puerto Rican icon, birthplace of future scientists. Until 7 months ago, that is, when gravity got the best of an engineering marvel that had endured everything thrown its way for decades, and the entire platform crashed down.
Since that fateful day, plenty of eyes have turned to analyzing what went wrong, while many hands have gotten to work sorting through and cleaning up the wreckage. And the brains have been doing what brains do best, dreaming of what science might come next for the site. For one group of scientists with deep ties to Arecebo, that meant dreaming up an entirely new type of telescope, one that would fill the gap left by the iconic instrument, then go much further.
I personally think that this was the first cut. This was done in the wake of the collapse just to show that there are viable options of continuing the legacy of fantastic science at the telescope. Tracy Becker, a planetary scientist at the Southwest Research Institute in San Antonio and co-author on a white paper describing the design, told Space.com. "I don't think that this version has to necessarily be what a new, built version will look like," she added. "It could end up looking more like the original telescope, or it could look completely different from anything that we've imagined so far. The primary goal was to show that we could use that space and continue that legacy of really powerful science." The design, dubbed the Next Generation Arecebo Telescope, is perhaps better approached as a statement than a blueprint. Right now, scientists aren't even sure this particular design can be built. But the project was meant to paint a picture of what the next 60 years of science at Arecebo could perhaps look like, if institutions are willing to show up for the facility, and to do so with ambition.
"We had to think bold and we had to think big, because you don't inspire the next generations and you don't serve the next generations if you just want to do what you were doing." Nomi Pinilla Alonso, Deputy Principal Scientist at Arecebo Observatory, told Space.com. "That was a result of someone thinking bold and big 60 years ago." Pinilla Alonso, who is also a planetary scientist at the University of Central Florida, which manages the observatory, is one of dozens of co-authors on the design concept.
The design came together within just 2 months of the collapse. In part, that's because the process was a salve for scientists with close ties to and strong feelings for the observatory. "It was not so long that it took me to pass from the feeling of sadness, of frustration, to the feeling of, we're doing something good. We're working, we're making progress," Pinilla Alonso said. Now, the scientists behind the new concept are trying to keep the momentum going in order to try to accelerate the rebuilding process, another white paper co-author, told Space.com. "Arecebo left a really big hole," he said. "We have hundreds of scientists right now that are scrambling to find another telescope that will be able to give them the data they need to continue their projects.
But there's only so much more that scientists can do on their own, before any institutions step up to fund work on the project." Meanwhile, the U.S. National Science Foundation, NSF, which owns the site, held a virtual workshop throughout June to explore options for Arecebo Observatory writ large. Officials have emphasized that Arecebo will continue to exist, but the agency has not committed to rebuilding the telescope as it stood, or to supporting a new project at similar scale. The workshop didn't allocate any funding and wasn't meant to result in selected projects.
There is no current plan to build a new radio telescope, although this is certainly an idea worthy of discussion, workshop leaders wrote in a document describing the process. For this workshop, however, our main goal is to explore a broad range of options for the short dash, medium and long term, which should engage all segments of the community and may be complementary.
During the workshop, then, the agency focused on broader consideration of the site's future. NSF is committed to participating in this future development but is not restricting the ideas to the construction of a new telescope, the document noted. That is certainly one long-term possibility. There are many others, and also near-term projects that could bridge the gap while a potential large project is being designed. The grand design isn't the only option the NSF will contemplate when it decides what to do with the telescope's legacy. The observatory overall can resume some science activities fairly quickly. There's a host of other equipment at the site that is still working, unaffected by the collapse, and observatory leadership wants to repair at least some of the antennas of one experiment set at the center of the dish to use elsewhere. Although the crash destroyed all the equipment on the science platform, which had been suspended above the vast 1,000-foot, 305 meters, dish on a web of 39 cables from a trio of towers, parts of the radio telescope may have more life in them. NSF officials have said that at least half of the dish survived the collapse, and the panels aren't particularly difficult or expensive to replace. And the bottom portion of all 3 towers that held the suspended cables remain sturdy, the NSF has said.
That combination could be the basis for rebuilding the lost telescope essentially as it was, but using newer technology and more advanced materials. There are many directions to go in. Joanna Rankin, a radio astronomer at the University of Vermont who is not a co-author on the white paper but did formally endorse it, told Space.com. Of course, it's exciting to choose the most ambitious and technologically exciting one, but it's not the only choice.
The daring next-generation Arecebo telescope design traces its roots to Zoom meetings that Rankin, who first arrived at the facility 5 decades ago and has used it ever since, organized in November, when the old telescope's precarity became clear. Quickly dubbed vigils, the gathering started with a dozen attendees but ballooned to encompass a couple hundred scientists. The daring next-generation Arecebo telescope design traces its roots to Zoom meetings that Rankin, who first arrived at the facility 5 decades ago and has used it ever since, organized in November, when the old telescope's precarity became clear. Quickly dubbed vigils, the gathering started with a dozen attendees but ballooned to encompass a couple hundred scientists.
Then, on December 1st, the telescope fell. After the collapse, there was a meeting or two that was kind of a ghoulish, "Oh my goodness, what happened?" Rankin said, dissecting how the telescope collapsed and the resulting damage.
But that mood quickly dissipated, she said, as scientists turned their focus to the future. Immediately, the thing which came to our mind is we should have a plan to rebuild it, Anish Roshi, a radio astronomer at Arecebo Observatory and the lead author of the white paper, told Space.com. That's when all the discussions and meetings with the community, everything became very active, discussing what to replace this telescope with and how to rebuild this telescope.